I think it's time. Why don't we get started? Good evening. I'm Sanjeev Sopti. I have the privilege of co-chairing CASI's advisory board. On behalf of CASI, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this year's Nand and Jeet Khemka Distinguished Lecture. This series is now in its 18th year, and this year, Perry World House is a co-sponsor. For those new to CASI is a highly respected policy-relevant research center. Its presence at a premier university gives it a unique and special vitality. The center has a three-part mission: to conduct research on policy challenges facing contemporary India, to nurture a new generation of scholars across disciplines, and to provide a forum for dialogue among the academic, business, and policy communities. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Nikhil Anand, Interim Director of CASI.
Thanks so much, Sanjeev, and good evening to everybody. It is such a pleasure to welcome Dean Trodden, Associate Dean Hannum, the CASI International Advisory Board, and colleagues and friends gathered here today. The Nand and Jeet Khemka Distinguished Lecture Series is an endowed public program launched in 2007 and made possible through the generous support of the Nand and Jeet Khemka Foundation. The series brings renowned India specialists to the Penn community and serves as a critical forum for analyzing and understanding India's complex economic, political, social, and environmental challenges. For 3 decades now, since the international community committed to addressing its causes in Rio, climate change has posed a significant challenge to countries and peoples around the world, perhaps nowhere more than in India today. India's population of 1.4 billion people today confront many of climate's life-taking effects. For example, 2 weeks ago, flooding in Punjab, the breadbasket of India, caused widespread crop destruction, decimating its farmers' crops. Last month, hundreds of people went missing after catastrophic flooding in Uttarakhand. The effects of climate change, heat waves, floods, and cyclones are an increasingly common condition of the political present in India, in the US, and everywhere in between. We find here, there, and everywhere that a stable climate is a precondition for economic development and social justice, and not the other way around. So given all that we know, why isn't climate change being addressed by global regimes and national governments as the emergency that it is? What are national governments doing about climate in national and also international fora? We are so pleased to welcome our Khemka Distinguished Lecturer, Navroz Dubash, to today's lecture and discussion with Sanya Karli and Vaishnavi Chandrasekhar. Professor Navroz Dubash is Professor of Public and International Affairs and the High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton University. His work explores emergent patterns of climate governance suitable to meet both the challenges of the climate crisis and unmet development aspirations that continue to be in India today. Prior to Princeton, he spent 15 years at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. He is also currently co-editor-in-chief of Climate Policy and has published widely on national climate policy, international cooperation, energy transitions, and air quality. Professor Dubash also has extensive experience serving in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, most recently as coordinating lead author of the 6th Assessment Report, and is member of the United Nations Environmental Programme's Emission Gaps Report. He also has advised the Government of India over the last decade and is a member of advisory committees on climate change, energy, and air and water policy, and has coordinated a team to draft India's long-term low-emissions development strategy. We have been delighted to welcome Professor Dubash back to CASI this week. His engagement with CASI goes back over 15 years, including a climate change article for CASI's publication, India in Transition, His participation in CASI's 2009 conference, India's Climate Options, and later contributed a chapter to the second edition of the 2017 volume, Rethinking Public Institutions. Following the lecture, he will be joined in discussion with Sonia Carley, who is the Mark Allen Hughes Faculty Director of the Kleinman Center and the Presidential Distinguished Professor of Energy Policy and City Planning at the Stuart Weitzman School of Design. She holds secondary appointments at the Wharton School and the School of Social Policy and Practice. She also coordinates the Energy Justice Lab and is a Resources for the Future Fellow. Professor Carley's research focuses on energy justice and just transitions, energy insecurity, electricity and transportation markets, and public perceptions of energy, infrastructure, and technologies. With the Energy Justice Lab team, she has built and maintains the Utility Disconnection Dashboard. Professor Carley is the author of the 5th National Climate Assessment Report and is a member of the Innovation Policy Forum and the Roundtable on Macroeconomics and Climate-Related Risks and Opportunities, respectively, for the National Academies. Finally, Vaishnavi Chandrasekhar is an award-winning science and environmental journalist based in Mumbai and a CASI 2025 Visiting Fellow. She has worked as a reporter and editor for more than 2 decades, including stints at the Christian Science Monitor in Boston and the Times of India in Mumbai, where she is currently an editorial consultant and contributing correspondent for Science. Vaishnavi specializes in writing on environment, science and development, especially climate change and urbanization in India. Her work has appeared in a variety of publications, including The Caravan, The Guardian, The Atlantic, Manga Bay, and more. She has received several awards for her work, including the Feststaub Award for Environmental Journalism and a U.S. National Academy's Eric and Wendy Schmidt Award for Science Communication in 2023. She has an MA in journalism from Columbia University in New York. The title for Professor Dubash's lecture today is Domesticating Climate Change, the Intertwining of Climate and Development in India. Following the lecture, Professor Dubash will be joined by Professors Carley and Vaishnavi Chandrasekhar in discussion, following which there will be time for questions from the audience. So welcome everybody. Before we begin, just a gentle reminder to switch off your phones. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Dubash.
Thank you so very much for that generous introduction. I want to start by thanking Dean Trodden and the leadership of University of Pennsylvania for this invitation, Dr. Sobti and the leadership of CASI, of course, Professor Anand, Juliana D'Agostini, and the whole team at CASI, who've been incredibly warm and generous during the day and a half I've been here. As Dr. Anand said, as Professor Anand said, I have been involved with CASI in all sorts of capacities for a long time, but this is my first time physically visiting here. So I'm really pleased to actually make it this time. I'm going to speak today on the domesticating climate change. I should have chosen an easier title, clearly. The intertwining of climate and development in India. And I want to start actually by trying to explain why I've chosen this word, what I'm trying to get at with this phrase, domesticating and domestication. I'm going to start with a little vignette to try and sort of motivate the conversation. And this vignette is about a recent judgment in India by the Supreme Court of India in the case of Ranjit Singh versus the Union of India. It deserves to be better known, and hopefully I'll make it so, at least in small ways through this talk. So in 2021, the original judgment of Ranjit Singh versus the Union of India was surrounded the case of the great Indian bustard, which is a short-sighted bird that had a habit of flying into transmission lines because it's short-sighted, right? There are only about 100 of these birds left. It is very, very close to extinction. And the Supreme Court essentially decided or gave the opinion that all transmission lines in its habitat should be buried underground. This was appealed And in 2024, the appeal, incidentally, was the Ministry of Power, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, and the Ministry of Environment, Forests, and Climate Change. And the 2024 judgment removed that blanket ban and set up, as Indian authorities do, a committee to decide whether on case-by-case basis these lines should be underground or not. The final decision had made three arguments about why this change was necessary. First, interestingly, they said India has international climate commitments. Now, internationally, India argues all the time that domestic decision-making shouldn't be inflected by climate obligations because of the historical responsibility of the West and the fact that India hasn't contributed that much to causing this problem. The second reason was the plethora of socio-economic benefits, they said, of solar energy. So this really became about transmission lines for solar energy, though, of course, transmission lines have purposes to transmit electricity, whatever the source. And the third, and this is the most interesting, they declared that coming out of India's Article 14 on the right to life and Article 21 on the right to equality in the Constitution, they read into the Constitution a right to be free from the adverse effects of climate change. This is actually an enormous, sweeping judgment, right? So for those of us in the room who are Indians, how many of us knew we had a right to be free from the adverse effects of climate change, right? So is this a far-sighted judgment? Well, there's been differing opinions in India. There's been a lot of debate, as is, those of us who are Indians and argumentative Indians expect this. So some people said that this is really a far-sighted and a path-breaking judgment. It lays constitutional foundations for human rights related to climate change in India, right? So that was one view. Others, including myself and my colleague Shibani Ghosh, argued that this is a pretty hollow right. It's not well specified, and how it would be actually implemented is really unclear. So, for example, coal-fired power plants. On the basis of this right, can we bring litigation saying they should be closed down earlier? Perhaps. Could you also bring an argument to that says, well, coal-fired power plants power electricity, which is needed for cooling, and therefore those plants should be kept open because we have a right to be protected from the adverse effects, including heat. Both arguments are actually plausible, right? So it doesn't give much guidance for litigation. Most interesting was an article recently by Justice Gautam Patel, a retired justice, who called this an act of jurisprudential prestidigitation. Now, of course, in part I put out that quote because I just think I had to look up that word. Maybe all of you do. Apparently, it's a Dungeons and Dragons term, and basically comes out of sort of a digitation, meaning fingers, magic fingers. And his whole quote says, latching onto solar power and then extrapolating to climate change, and then pushing further to pit the great Indian bustard against the possible damage to other species is jurisprudential prestidigitation. And he ends by saying, this judgment almost certainly ensures the extinction of the great Indian bustard. So pretty strong sort of condemnation of the judgment. The reason I'm dwelling on this at length is that I think the judgment tells us three things. First, that for the Supreme Court, and this was one of the last judgments of a well-known Chief Justice, Justice Chandrachud, climate change has become a way to make your mark. This is sort of seen as this was a really seen in the judicial community as a pitch for some sort of legacy judgment. And it's interesting that climate change, as a relatively marginal issue in Indian politics, should be what he would choose for that kind of landmark. The second is it's an infrastructure-friendly decision, right? And if you want to be free from the adverse effects, it's interesting that there's no mention of adaptation, which is normally associated with the rights, with conservation and preserving natural resources. So it's a very convoluted sort of way of doing things to link it to renewable energy. And third, I think this shows that domestication in India is definitely underway, but it's happening in very complex and contradictory ways, right? So I really thought that this is a good way of sort of setting this up and trying to unpack what I mean by domestication of climate change in India. What I'm going to try and do now is to take you through, hopefully quite quickly, a series of questions. I won't read all of them out, but I'm going to start at the global level. Why do we need to domesticate a global environmental problem? I think that actually needs to be interrogated. Second, I want to talk about narrative shifts and the politics that are associated with them. I then want to talk about something that climate junkies talk about a lot, which is models and emissions models. And I will perhaps bore you, but I'll take you through a couple of reasons why I think those are worth looking at. I'll then get into the energy part of the story and adaptation before ending with a story about the state and how important it is to think about the state. And I'm going to conclude by asking the question, which Professor Carley asked me in our pre-call, do we like domestication? I thought that's actually a good way to end. So I'm going to, with thanks for that way of framing it, that's where I'm going to end the talk. Okay, so to begin with, I hope you can see most of these slides. You don't have to read all the text. I'll walk you through it. Why do we need to domesticate a global environmental problem? So I want to start by sort of, in a sense, teasing apart why we should think of this as a global environmental problem, and are there other ways of thinking about it? So how do we deal with these problems? Well, we begin by meeting, now can you see this pointer? Just about. Well, we begin at the top left there with these big global meetings, these climate COPs, the next one is coming up, and government delegates sit in a room and they eventually come up with some sort of text, some sort of agreement. In the case of the Paris Agreement, the text said that we should agree to holding the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and aspiring and pursuing efforts to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees. How does that get operationalized? Well, the modelers go to work. And in the top right there, you have what is an iconic diagram in my community, the emissions gap diagram. You don't need to understand all of it, but it's basically emissions over time. And the dark black line is actual emissions. The rest of the lines are projections. So the lines at the top there are what we are currently on track to do. And the two steep lines sloping downwards are what science would like us to do. And the difference between those two, the sets of orange and red lines, is the gap. The only thing you really need to know from this is there is a gap, and it's big, right? It's actually very big. We have to decrease emissions by on the order of 60, 70% in the next 10 or 20 years in order to meet what science says is expected of us. How does that happen? That happens through countries going home and coming up with national plans and policies that leads to emissions reductions. That's the model, the top-down model of climate change as a global environmental problem, right? But that's not the only way to look at it. The other way to look at it is a bottom-up construction. And here we go. And in this construction, those national plans and policies are actually the outcome of a series of things happening really in the trenches. And what are those things? Some of them are climate related, headlines on typhoon hit Philippines, for example. Others are actually about jobs. Some of those jobs may be climate related. Some of them may just be demographic transition and trying to find jobs. Others are natural disasters that may or may not be climate related, like drought, basic things like a surge in fuel prices, right? And all of those things play into how countries will formulate their policies, including climate policies. So these policies are inflected by day-to-day politics. And so national plans and policies that lead to emissions reductions may not start with the objective of emissions reductions, or maybe pushed in different directions, right? Because of domestic political pressures. So actually the messy reality of what countries come up with is a composite of all these forces, right? So that's another way to look at it. And the way in which the international regime is structured actually brings these together, right? So it's the top down meets the bottom up. And the Paris Agreement, which is this little graphic on the left here, in a sense, tries to bring those two things together. It's a way of putting on one slide what the Paris Agreement is meant to be. So there's an objective up at the top. There's support that's meant to be given internationally. You then have these nationally determined contributions. You have reporting of progress, and every 5 years you have a global stocktake. Now, the question is, where does the cycle start? Some people think it should start with the objective. But in reality, the rate limiting step is that one at the bottom. What can national political economies agree on or not agree on? That's what's going to drive how fast we move. And over the years, I've become more and more convinced that that's where our analytical attention should be, in the bottom half of this diagram down here, looking at narrative links, political mobilization, policy frameworks, and institutions and laws at the national level that mediate domestic pressures and what countries put on the table. Can the global accelerate things? Yes, at the margin, but really, I'm not sure that they can shift unfavorable domestic politics, and we may be living through that moment right now where we sit, right? So what I really want to do then is in the rest of the talk, focus on these sorts of themes, not sequentially, but in an integrated way, the narrative, the politics, the policy, and the institutions, because I think that's what's going to decide whether we actually address climate change and how effectively. And I want to look at those things in the Indian context. Okay, so I'm starting with the narrative story, right? So rolling back the clock, when India really started down this journey, climate change was really seen as something alien, something out there, something caused by the West, and the politics was really zero-sum. We needed carbon to develop, and if we were deprived of that carbon, it would directly impact our development. So this became a conversation around climate change as equity and carbon as a constraint, right? So the solution then was to allocate the carbon budget on some basis that would be equitable, in particular on a per capita basis was what was proposed. That's sort of the formulation, and India became, there's the little cartoon, which was the cover of a very widely cited report, right, by Center for Science and Environment, with, you know, sort of an intrusive Westerner with a big car sort of trying to stop a subsistence person cutting down a tree. So that was very much the kind of imagery for 2 decades of climate politics. And this was something held true in both domestic governmental and non-governmental circles, right? Fast forwarding, there have been at least 2 moments of change, right? That equity first, equity only story started getting challenged and dissolved in 2 ways. One very critical intervention was actually by Greenpeace India, who said, you know, really, if we claim all this carbon, is it going to do any good to India's poor? Or are we hiding behind the poor? Right? It was a very heated conversation, but it hit home, it stuck. And the second question is, given what we know about the science, do we really have a right to burn? I mean, if we get allocated all this carbon, should we not have some responsibility to achieve development objectives without burning it all? And that opened the door to this conversation around carbon as a co-benefit, which said, yes, we're going to pursue development, but we're going to look for opportunities where development and climate change can be brought together, right? And in a sense, the last 10, 15 years of my time in India has been part of, with many other people, trying to shift the policy conversation to that middle ground, to the point that this was my 50th birthday present from my team. This Keep Calm and Co-Benefit poster was what they presented me, because I went on about this so much. It was also, this co-benefit language was also the basis of India's national action plan. So all sorts of things happened, and I'll show you a slide later that reflects this, to try and seek these co-benefits, but in an opportunistic way. And the next phase, really, that we are sort of partway towards moving towards, is whether green growth is actually an opportunity that we shouldn't just be looking for episodically as and when we can, but should we be structuring our economies and our businesses to more systematically steer the economy proactively in that direction, right? And we're now in a place where we have multiple coexisting strands of all of these. You'll find shades of all of these narratives in official and unofficial conversation. What we don't talk about a lot is that far right, which is the existential story, right? So this is we're fooling ourselves in thinking that this is kind of going to be addressed through minor changes, and the economic costs are in fact, and the social costs are existential. So that has much less salience, even now, I think, in India, but I'd be curious to hear in particular from Vaishnavi and others whether she shares that view. So taking this forward, what might a more multi-stranded climate narrative look like? So I'm going to start by first just giving you a sense of the different voices in which the government speaks, right? So there's 2 quotes here on the left, one from the Ministry of Finance annual economic survey from a couple of years ago. And they basically say the best defense against climate change is to have continued development. The most effective way to combat climate change is to let nations grow first. And they feel the need to rely on Thomas Schelling from 2005. So they quote him extensively. And it's a little it's a little out of date in my view, right? This idea that the climate and development are sequential processes as opposed to integrated. But in other documents, such as the low carbon strategy that I was involved in, they say India seeks to identify and explore opportunities to shift to low carbon development pathways. So these strands are kind of coexisting. It's not unified. And the reason I emphasize this is because these narratives and their buy-in shape the political opportunities for the private sector, for civil society, and very importantly, for entrepreneurial bureaucrats within the government. And I'll give you an example of how that has played out in the past. So what I offer then in something I've recently written is, in India, it's really time to move beyond this dichotomy between climate and development. We need to sort of ban the Thomas Schelling 2005 quotes, in my view, and move to something that really says the job here is to identify pathways to low carbon and climate resilient futures. What's interesting about that formulation is it gives you an analytical question. What are those pathways? Where are their trade-offs and where are their synergies? That's a question you can analytically examine and that you can politically build towards. What then about climate equity? Well, the climate equity story, which is a story about how the North has disproportionately contributed to the problem, it's definitely true. In fact, this came up in a conversation with the undergrads this morning. But the idea of a carbon budget is useful to understand culpability for the past. It's not a great way to organize ourselves for the future because the idea of a right to burn is just not tenable in a 1.5 degree world, right? And maybe the way to think about carbon is less as a resource and more as a way of understanding the different, what different parts of the global community bring to the table. So does India need finance support? Probably. Does it need technology support? Probably. And the basis for that should be these equity discussions, but in the service of low carbon and resilient futures, right? So how does all this play out now in the grammar of models, which is really where a lot of this conversation happens? And I'm going to take you through a slightly complicated diagram here, but please bear with me. So this is something that some colleagues and I did when we were just in the build-up to Paris. And the question we were asking is, what do the models in India project in terms of India's future? So on the y-axis here, you have India's projected 2030 emissions, so for one point in time. And on the x-axis are different growth rates, right? So along this 15-year period from 2015 to 2030, will India grow at 6, 7, 8 or greater? It starts at 2 gigatons of CO2 because that was India's emissions in 2015, right? And what you see is there's this incredibly wide scatter. So some models say India will barely increase. Some say it'll increase from 2 to 5, right? So more than 200%, 250%, right? And those red tram lines in the middle are what India's Paris pledge, that's the range for India's Paris pledge. So if you're above that, you're beyond Paris pledge. If you're below that, you're below Paris pledge. The two things I want you to take away from this is just how incredibly wide that range of projected emissions is. And what it suggests is that different policy pathways, so these bubbles represent different policy pathways. The green one is the most sort of climate ambitious one. The one at the top is a business as usual one, and so on. So they suggest different emissions futures. And so these are actually malleable. We're not locked in. You can actually change this, is what this message says. But it also says that we have modeling studies that don't really give us a very good guide. I mean, remember, this is only a 15-year horizon, right? So to say you can be 20% above 2015, or you could be 250% above 2015, it doesn't give a lot of confidence. This is what the government was working with for its decision-making. So what we suggested to the government, and they were receptive, was to say, look, it's not about emissions trajectories only. It's actually what you're doing is you're picking different visions of Indian futures. It's different future Indias that you're looking at. And so in a subsequent paper, what we did is we looked at multiple aspects, but I'm projecting one of them here, which is industrial energy use, right? How much energy does Indian industry use now, and how much will it use in the future? And what's really interesting here is we compared it to other countries. So just to walk you through this, This is industrial energy use per capita, and this is GDP per capita. This is now looking off into the future, into 2050, right? So further in the future in previous graphs. So these countries, Korea, China, are 2018 data points. So Korea actually has pretty high energy use and pretty high GDP. China is more energy intensive because it uses quite a lot of energy for a lot less GDP, right? This is back in 2018. And these are other countries, Turkey, Argentina, and so on. India is all the way here, which basically shows that India, back in 2018, was using a lot less energy for industry and had much lower GDP. What's going to happen in 2050? That's what these dots tell you, right? And so if you believe this model, India in 2050 is going to move in the direction of Korea, mind you, not reach anywhere where Korea is today, but move in that direction. If you believe this, we're going to become like China. And if you believe this, we're going to do something that has never been done in history before, which is grow GDP a little and decrease our energy use, right? So these models are actually shot through with unrealistic assumptions that don't actually help policymakers because they're not asking questions about development. So this has been backed out from the models. These are all emissions models from which we backed out these development indicators. And so what we were trying to say is, let's ask questions about the development futures and have a conversation based on that, because that's what voters want to know about. Let's have abstract conversations about emissions when they're backed by completely unrealistic stories about what development futures are like, right? So the larger point I want to make is we've talked about climate change in a way that is captured by an emissions frame. That doesn't help, given that the politics is going to be about something other than emissions. It's going to be about jobs, fuel security, et cetera, industrial futures. And that's what we want analytical light to be shed on. So when I had a chance to engage in India's long-term strategy, this is a really tiny writing, and I apologize. What we managed to do with the ministry is to build the long-term strategy around a series of low-carbon sectoral development futures. So this one up here is about electricity, transport, urban and buildings, industry, carbon dioxide removal, land use, and finance, right? And we said, for each of these, let's figure out the building blocks and the questions we have to ask. And we may not be able to model all of it, but we managed to get working groups around each of these that include ministerial and non-ministerial actors. So it framed the conversation for India's future around these development trajectories rather than around emissions. Right? And I think this is the conversation that we need to be having. Excuse me, I'm just going to get a sip. So if this is the question we should be having, let's maybe dive into a couple of these areas. Let's see what it looks like. So I'm going to start with electricity, which is the sector that I know best. And the question is, can India manage to make a low carbon transition in a way that is socially and economically relatively non-disruptive? And the answer is a resounding maybe. The solar story in India started with the National Solar Mission of 2009 as probably the best example of that co-benefits logic I talked about earlier. It started as an energy security measure. It was sold domestically as energy security. It was sold internationally as low carbon. No problem. Politics is the art of the possible. You figure out how to tell the story for different audiences as long as you get there. And it was remarkably successful. They did all sorts of interesting things, like a reverse auction system where they said recipients of subsidies have to bid for the lowest possible subsidy they would accept, right? Which is a very creative way of doing things. And they subsidized that with low-cost central coal power that was kept by for reserve, right? So financially, too, it was really well managed. It was quite creative. And it did its job. The auction prices came down from 17 rupees per kilowatt hour in the first bid to 12 rupees in the second bid to 5 rupees, 7 or 5 rupees in the third bid, and is now hovering at around 2 to 3 rupees, cost competitive with coal, right? In a matter of 14 years or a bit under 12 to 14 years. So it's quite a remarkable story. Of course, it owes this price decline to global trends in Germany, in China, and other places, but we seized them and took full advantage of them, right? And if you look at the air pollution gains that would come from this and the social benefits, it's far more than cost competitive, right? We should be adding renewable energy at a breakneck speed, and we sort of are. So between 2015-16 and 23-24, you can see the addition. It's that green wedge and of renewables, and we are now at the level where we are about 40% renewable in terms of capacity, right? Which is pretty good, and we will probably be at 50% within the next few years. But what has happened on the other side of the story, which is coal, right? So coal has shrunk as a share of capacity, but if you look at that bottom graph, in terms of generation, how many kilowatt hours are actually generated? As a share of the total, the demand has grown, right? So the total has grown, but as a share, coal has hovered at around 80%. For the last 4 years, it's been stuck at 80%. So 50% share of capacity, the number of gigawatts or kilowatts that you can generate, and the number of units or kilowatt hours that you actually generate, right? It's stuck at 80%. So why is that, right? Right now, we can do both these things because demand in India is growing for electricity, and so both renewable energy and coal can be accommodated. There's no contest between them, right? So the politics right now is non-conflictual between these two. But in the future, India has a much more stringent target. In fact, 43% of India's electricity is supposed to be from renewable sources by 2030. We're now at 78 or 79%, right? Then the rubber will hit the road. So what holds us in place? What causes change? What are the sort of politics of this? I'm going to go through just a few snapshots of what holds coal in place and what is holding renewables back, right? So in coal, the politics around it are that a large number of jobs are at stake and an even larger number of communities who are dependent on those coal jobs. By some estimates, about 4 million people, in particular in coal states, are dependent on those jobs, right? So that's very disruptive. There are conversations about how to change that, but that is a big factor. There is lock-in to the finance around coal-fired power plants because the financiers haven't really been paid back yet. The average age of the Indian coal fleet is 12 years. The lifetime is about 40 years. Those financiers need to be paid back, otherwise there'll be contagion into the financial system, right? There are all kinds of cross-sectoral lock-ins. Railways is an interesting one. Coal accounts for about 50% of the railways' freight revenue. And railways revenue is really important because it cross-subsidizes passenger rail, which is politically hugely important in a nation of 100 million migrants, right? So politically, for all governments, they have to keep those costs down. If you actually have that coal piece of the revenues taken out, it has huge impact on the politics of the railway sector. And it's actually interesting. India's, I think, probably the only country I know of where a week before you have the annual budget announcement, you have a separate rail budget. It has its own budget, right? It's politically that important. Royalties. Coal-bearing states get a lot of their revenue from coal royalties. And then there are these weird contractual pieces, right? So we have these so-called take-or-pay contracts where electricity contracts are based on having to pay the fixed costs whether you use the power or not, right? So that locks you into using those power. On the renewable energy side, we have this history of really complicated distribution companies. And the risk is that if renewable energy becomes cheap enough that commercial users and industrial users go off the grid, they're the best paying customers. And so poor customers who are cross-subsidized won't be cross-subsidized anymore, and prices will go up for those poor customers, and that will be politically disruptive as well, right? So almost before every election in India, state election, one of the things that governments announce is free power for farmers, right? So those kinds of things will become much harder to do. The cost of finance is high cost. So in India, for renewable energy, the average cost is about 6% of financing for projects. In Europe, it's 3%, right? So it gives you a sense. Interestingly, renewable energy has been promoted worldwide as kind of a, as part of a story about energy democracy and decentralization. Not in India. We're doing big centralized renewables. So that also shifts the politics, and it's actually led to renewable energy becoming a big political voting bloc, and that ties back to Ranjit Singh versus the Union of India, right? They were powerful enough to actually get that transmission line judgment reversed. I think they played a role in there. And finally, India went down the road of promoting deployment of renewables and not manufacturing, and has now come to regret it as compared to, say, China, because renewables are not a job-creating sector. So we're frantically trying to get in on that game a little bit late. So the point is that this transition is likely to become disruptive. There are all kinds of entrenched politics taking you out to railways and finance and coal and distribution companies, and this is not going to be an easy knot to untie, right? So if electricity is going to be disruptive, what about climate change itself? So I want to take a little time to talk about climate impacts and the fact that they're growing in India and what we're trying to do about it. So this is, again, part of the story about, so the electricity story really kind of, I went into some detail because it tells us, it gives us a really sort of trenchant example of this domestication process. Addressing climate change in India means addressing this Gordian knot of Indian electricity that has kind of congealed over time with all sorts of complicated strands, right? And some of that is also true of adaptation. What do we expect to see in India? So if you look, I just did a little search in preparing for this paper. There's a flurry of new research. This one really struck my eye, and it's just come out in the top left here. They basically say that a 1% annual temperature variation will lead to a 3.9% decline in long-term economic growth. That's actually twice earlier estimates. That is absolutely enormous. And they say that happens through labor effects. It happens through capital effects because machinery works less effectively, and it happens through ecosystem services effects, right? So ecosystem services under temperature conditions, those are provided less effectively. The key sectors are construction, agriculture, and these services, and it varies a lot across states, right? So this is, as a mainstream, remember that slide of the father and son with the, skewering the, this starts getting into that territory, right? If you look at heat impacts, the bottom left here, my colleagues at the Sustainable Futures Collaborative, an organization I'm affiliated with in India, did a really interesting exercise with some Berkeley colleagues where they asked the question, if we went from 1.2 degrees warming, which is where we are now, to the 1.5 threshold, a 0.3 degree difference, right? How much more frequently would we see heat crossing a threshold that people who look at this say is an important threshold, which is the 98th percentile of the historical heat record on any given day, right? So the 98th percentile. All of Northwest India here and parts of Pakistan would see that threshold crossed 20% more often, right? So huge impacts. And that's just at 1.5. We're almost certainly headed to 1.8, 1.9, where these numbers will be much higher. This is for Nick Hill, but this is a map of Mumbai coastal, and Vaishnavi. This is a map of Mumbai coastal flooding under various scenarios, right? So all the wealthy land is on the coast. It's all underwater under these scenarios. And this is a graph of crop yields from the IPCC. Most of these crop yields are trending downwards, right? So crop yields are going to go down. So how do we address this? So I'm going to give you an example of the same colleagues who did the heat study. They did a survey of 9 cities covering about 11% of India's vulnerable population. And they said, what are the kinds of measures that people are talking about? And I want to draw your attention to the ones in the rings there. So they broke it up into short-term measures, which is, providing more water, emergency shade, etc. Long-term measures that are both intentional and incidental, things that would happen in the normal course of events, and things that are intentionally done to address heat, right? And all of these cities have heat action plans. And the kinds of things that need to be done include things that require much more effective provision of municipal services, whether it's around fire, whether it's around health, so something like health insurance, whether it's about water body rejuvenation. So the interesting thing is this all comes out through heat action plans. But heat action plans are a new institutional innovation that have to find a way of making the existing machinery of urban service provision work better. So in other words, are we saying that to solve or to deal, in fact, with the adverse effects of climate change, we have to solve long-standing problems of urban governance in Indian cities? That's sort of a sobering thought, right? Because we haven't really done it yet. So they asked, what are the challenges? And the challenges are the standard challenges of the Indian state: coordination failures, competing priorities, weak technical capacity, and so on, right? So again, this is really a domestication story. Climate change isn't something out there. We're coming to grips with how climate change inflects all the problems we've been grappling with all along. Nikhil, do I have another 5 minutes or so? Yeah, okay, thanks. All right, because I really want to spend a little bit of time on my sort of pet theme, which is the state, right? What do we do about all this? So the adaptation story suggests that the state is a big part of the potential part of the solution, could also be part of the problem. And what we have actually done over the years in India is built quite an impressive climate state, at least at first glance, if you look at sort of boxes on an organogram. So we did a little mapping. The little peach-colored boxes are what the Indian climate state looked like in 2007. The Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Power, parts of the Ministry of External Affairs that did negotiations. So those were really the parts pre-2007. Then you had the National Action Plan on Climate Change. And suddenly there was this proliferation because the National Action Plan was organized around 8 missions, right? So Green India mission, solar mission, this mission, that mission, and they embedded cells in all the line ministries. So you had this flurry of yellow up here, right? Which is all the different line ministries getting involved. And critically, they set up a governing structure in the Prime Minister's office with the Prime Minister's special envoy on climate change, who didn't last long because he fell afoul of the Minister of Environment and had a very public battle, and that's a separate story. We can get into it in Q&A if you're interested. And they also set up a Prime Minister's advisory council of sort of eminent people and so on and so forth. Fast forward further to the green areas in 2009, 2014, this spread to the states. Every Indian state had to do a state action plan, right? So actually, there was quite a lot going on. But what this conceals is that within each of these boxes was very, very thin capacity. So we filed right to information petitions. We said, how many people across, I think it was 9 ministries, have climate change in their title, even if it's just a quarter of their time, right? So across all these boxes, across 9 ministries, we found the number was 62, right? And of that, 22 were in the Ministry of Environment and in the Ministry of Renewable Energy. Another 8 or 9 in the Ministry of Power. So very complicated issues like how is Indian agriculture going to deal with climate change was like a person and a half, right? So it's sort of a very partial story. That conversation has started, but it started in a very mechanical way and in a very sort of opportunistic way. The question is, can we move towards building a more strategic version of an Indian climate state, right? What would that look like? And why am I so insistent on the state being involved? Because I think the scale of change, if you think about this as a low carbon, climate resilient transition, you have to work climate change through the fabric of how you design cities, how you build agriculture, or in these examples here, if you want to think about an enabling climate state, right, as opposed to a regulatory one, which just enforces targets, you've got to think about industrial policy for green jobs. China has done that remarkably successfully. What does that take? That takes R&D, right? It takes strategy setting ability, the ability to sort of understand your industry and pick winners and support them without getting captured by them, right? Without actually ending up being captured. So I just had colleagues pull some R&D numbers. So public R&D in India on clean energy between 2019 and 24 was about 1,100 crore, right? The amount of money that the public sector hydrocarbon entities, ONGC and all these oil and other extractive entities spend annually on R&D is about 1,000 crore. So we're spending about a fifth of what the public sector hydrocarbon industry is spending on clean energy R&D, while China is forging ahead with battery technology, EVs, solar, and so forth, right? So we're not nearly there yet. And the same sort of story can be told for resilient infrastructure in urban India, as I said, with agriculture, with forest conservation, with coastal development, and so on. So what we really need is an institutional thickening, but of a certain kind. And in a paper that we did, we looked at what countries, 8 countries, 4 developed, 4 developing, what they had done in terms of building a climate infrastructure, a state capacity infrastructure. And these 4 things jumped out, right? Knowledge creation, strategy setting, coordination, because working in silos doesn't work when you're talking about climate change, and very interestingly, mediating conflict. Because mediating the kinds of transitions we're talking about creates winners and losers will block progress unless there is some transition pathway for them, right? So what are the kinds of examples? We suggested something like a low carbon resilient development commission in India. There is no such body that is examining what the options are, what the trade-offs are, a place where think tanks and research institutes can sort of, and academia can work this out. A body that is above the Ministry of Environment, right? So what happens in India is the Ministry of Environment convenes some of these meetings. And in most countries, this is true. It is low in the pecking order. It's a low budget ministry. And it's a terrible term, but the more powerful ministries are called wet ministries, right? So the wet ministries, for reasons that perhaps you can imagine, the wet ministries don't show up to MOEFCC meetings. They deliberately will send junior people, right? So the ability to coordinate, you need this to be strategically placed within the bureaucratic structure at a higher level. You need a coordination structure, and you need a deliberative body. So in South Africa, for example, they actually have a presidential commission on climate change that deals with things like job losses as part of renewable energy transition, comes up with transition plans. It figures out, what is politically acceptable. I think we might need something of that sort. We also need to make sure this percolates down in Indian federalism, right? We have a very top-heavy federal structure in India. The states don't have a lot of responsibilities, control over a lot of sectors, but they do over key adaptation sectors. The state climate action plans are often pretty performative. I won't get into city climate plans, and Nikhil and I were talking about how there's a lot of work to be done, and I think he knows much more about this than I do. But these are proliferating, often with international networks involved. And if you're going to deepen this at the local level, one very interesting idea comes from Kenya, where Kenya's climate law actually has ward-level committees coming up with adaptation projects that are then funneled up in a competitive way and are funded, right? But the ideas come from below. That's something very interesting to think about. We need landing spots within states, more than 1.5 people in each of these places. We need ways for the center to provide knowledge public goods to the states, for example, things around weather prediction and forecast in usable ways. We can imagine state-state collaboration, so mountain states getting together, coastal states getting together. There are all kinds of things that can be built. And there's also scope for both national and state-level laws that enshrine this kind of enabling approach, right? I want to be clear. I am not saying that the state can solve this. But I am saying we can't solve this without the state. And the state has to play a coordinating role, bringing in other actors, including the private sector for industrial policy, including local communities for adaptation, in ways that are sort of porous, right? So that's a big ask. So I'm going to conclude here by just asking, do we like domestication of climate change? Sanya's question, right? And I think I like it sort of because it's a necessary first step. We can't be having these conversations unless we acknowledge it's necessary. The narratives remain really contested, right? We're not going to double down on this unless there's sort of agreement on this idea of low carbon development pathways, if people are pulling in opposite directions. And the work of imagining these futures remains to be done. So, all of you in the room, particularly the younger ones, I think this is work in progress. There are no silver bullets, certainly not judicial silver bullets. Building an enabling climate state is really necessary, but it really cuts across the grain of how the Indian state functions. I don't want to sugarcoat how difficult that is. And finally, low carbon climate resilient development, if we can make that a national project, it's a very open and encompassing one. It invites in all sorts of people. People who are interested in urbanization, people who are interested in job creation, people interested in technology, people interested in urban governance. And so I think it's a framing that actually allows a broadening of the climate change debate in India. And that's the sort of spirit that I want to convey when I use the term domestication. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Incredibly provocative and articulate. We have the opportunity to ask several questions, and we're going to seize that opportunity. We're going to start with a few questions ourselves, and then we'll open the floor for questions from all of you in the audience. And if I may take the lead with the first question, and I'll start at the beginning of your talk as well. I found your vignette very fascinating, and in particular, the right to be free of the adverse effects of climate change. And what struck me is that it's a philosophical argument, rooting back to Aristotle, connecting to notions of cosmopolitan justice. And it struck me, maybe I'll push back a little and say, doesn't that offer opportunities for bringing in more levels of government, for example, a judicial review, by giving one the right to freedom from something? And so can't that create more opportunities as opposed to, in its vagueness, causes problems?
So that's precisely the conversation this debate sparked, right? I think a lot of people saw it as an opportunity to broaden the conversation, to use the rights framing in particular as a wedge, particularly with government. I just feel like the two things gave me pause. One is, it's one thing to say, and I know there are people in the audience here who've worked on, say, the right to food. That's something very tangible. There are ways in which you can measure progress on that. The right to be free of the adverse effects has two pathways, right? One pathway, which is the more direct one, is to be more resilient. The judgment didn't talk about that at all. And the substance of the judgment, which is to allow infrastructure, actually works directly against it. The other pathway is to make the problem less, but India by itself can't make the problem less because of the free rider problem, right? So it just wasn't something that had conceptually been articulated in ways that allowed for sensible arguments and headed off bad ones. For example, it completely allows for an argument that says, keep a coal-fired power plant open because we can power more air conditioners, right? That's completely within the ambit of the judgment. So that was my hesitation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so much to talk about. So I want to add a couple of examples to the Great Indian Bustard. And another example of where a climate project can become problematic is the subsidized solar water pumps for farmers, which, if people know, farmers use water pumps to pump up groundwater to water their fields. And at one point, subsidies were given for solar water pumps, which is a good thing because they're not using so much electricity. But what happened was that allowed them to pump up much more groundwater. And that started to lead to more severe water problems, which we saw in Maharashtra, which is where I'm based and I know. Navroz, what really struck me about this idea of climate federalism is that because I'm based in Bombay and I see a lot of both climate impact and I see a lot of adaptation efforts on the ground, I see this kind of parallel structure that's in operation right now. One is the trickle down of climate policies from the center. And if I take Bombay itself as an example, you have, or Maharashtra as an example, which is the state that Bombay is in, you have a state climate action plan, You have a city climate action plan for Bombay, which is actually conceived in collaboration with C40 Cities, which is a global kind of initiative. You have, at the Bombay level, the municipality collaborating with scientists for hyperlocal flood forecasting. You have a plan for flood mitigation that's going to look for money to the National Disaster Management Authority. So you have a very strong impetus towards adaptation that partly comes from these federal centralized money and policies. On the other hand, you also have an incredible amount of development going on in Bombay right now. One of the biggest construction projects, Bombay is now one of the biggest construction project sites, I think, in the world, because of the unprecedented level of redevelopment of buildings, bridges, infrastructure that's being built, which is basically concretization of the city, which is adding to heat and adding to the flooding problems. And that's sort of in its own silo. So both these tracks are going on, and there's no connection. And of course, the building and development problem is because of other interests that are at play. And it just strikes me that there are these parallel structures of governance. I don't know how one reconciles these two.
So I very much share your frustration, and that's again why I like this kind of domestication. And I should say, a colleague of mine who was editing the volume I was writing for came up with this word, so I should credit Sharad Lele for the word. To solve climate change, we are going to have to we can't bypass these kinds of things you're talking about. One reason I focus on state capacity is that I have seen in a couple of places how enterprising bureaucrats who start with some kind of beachhead then actually make themselves functional within the bureaucracy to other interests, right? So one of the things that didn't happen in Bombay when there was this window of opportunity to address climate change is Bombay didn't set up, Mumbai, I guess, didn't set up, I'm sorry, I left when I was, before the name change, so I've never quite made the transition. Never set up a serious climate institutional structure in-house. And so you had C40, you had WRI, you had the Indian Climate Collaborative, all showing up. And it's a phenomenon I see in Delhi all the time, right? It's so many voices and so few years, right? There's just not enough ability to digest the material and internalize it. And the people who know how to play the bureaucratic politics best are the bureaucrats and the local politicians. So you need to build a beachhead within the city, an office where the interests of those bureaucrats are actually tied to negotiating those complexities as best they can. They will know what bits of analysis they need to head off the contractor lobby. They will know what bits of analysis they need to get the buy-in from low-income groups looking for better housing, right? That never happened, right? Which is why, so there's a sort of a bureaucratic politics that is part of larger politics. It's just too big to ignore, the bureaucracy in India. And to also think about how you can build allies. So I'll cut that short. The only example I'll give of that is the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, right? In the central level. It was set up as this tiny little outpost, as a little nubbin on the edge of the Ministry of Power with no power, authority, et cetera, et cetera. Along comes the National Action Plan on Climate Change, and they say we should have a national mission on enhanced energy efficiency. They hire Ajay Mathur, a very accomplished bureaucrat. He mobilizes money from donors. He gets people on. He manages to get a pipeline to the Prime Minister's office. The next G20 meeting, when he has to showcase something, he has something ready to showcase. And he basically drove a truck through the bureaucracy and made energy efficiency everybody's friend, right? And he played the politics very, very successfully. And to some extent, that was also true of the solar mission. And the missions that failed were those that were housed inside bureaucracies and where there wasn't ownership over those outcomes.
I'm going to give you a very general question, and you're welcome to take it in any direction that you'd like. But one key theme that I think I picked up from your lecture, as well as other conversations that we've had, is that climate is everything. Climate is energy efficiency. Climate is residential solar development. It's public transportation. It's so many of the, I mean, I think about the slide that you had with all of the different interventions, if you will, that one could implement. And that really strikes a chord for me, because I'm also of the mindset that climate will be a part of every industry, every profession going forward, and that we need to step up to the moment to recognize that climate is so deeply embedded. So my very broad question is, what are some of the implications in the academic setting for, if you agree with me that that's a takeaway, what are some of the implications for how we teach, what we teach, or how we conduct research?
Well, it's a very live question for me as a recent returnee to academia. So I'll tell you how I've tried to go about it. So I think the first step is to actually accomplish that reframing, because it really hasn't been accomplished. A lot of people who come to, say, my classes think that this is going to be a class about the Paris Agreement and global negotiations, right? So it is for the first couple of weeks, and then I spoon feed them a little bit, but they begin to see some of the dead ends there, if that's the only way in which you think about it. So reframing it to actually make the issue inviting for people who are interested in it but are daunted by the legal jargon and the complexity of it, right? They have to find ways in. Then building those coalitions. So if you frame this as more resilient cities, right? Or agricultural systems food and agricultural systems that are both lead to more nutritious food, avoid political lock-in. So in India, as we were talking with the students earlier today, all kinds of lock-in around fertilizer subsidies and so on and so forth. Climate change is actually a moment to break through some of those things, right? So it can actually, because so environmental issues in India have always been, at the back of the line politically. Climate change is at the front of the line, right? So can you harness this much more powerful locomotive to issues that we all care about anyway? Some of us for reasons that have to do with climate, others of us for reasons that may have to do with jobs, green energy, more livable cities, whatever the framing is, right? So I think if we have to structure the questions that way, then we can build sub-coalitions and networks across those coalitions, but we shouldn't be trying to build one machine.
So one of the things that I'm interested in is, I mean, you've been talking about the national, and I was at Climate Week earlier this week, and one of the words that I heard a lot on the first day, at least, was the subnational, and including from Scotland, which sort of considers itself a subnational donor country, right? Because it's devolved government. And a lot of people were asking, in the current context, where the global is sort of, in chaos, and national governments perhaps aren't doing enough, people were asking there, can subnational coalitions form? And they were asking this question, for COP30 coming up. I wonder what you think of that.
Look, I think that subnational, so as I tried to hint with the climate federalism work, I think that we have to look at this at multiple scales. And the academic literature goes in two directions. So there's one set of literature, particularly on the mitigation side, that says that if you act at the subnational level, you'll just get leakage, right? You put a cap on one city, industry will go to another city. There's another strand that says, yeah, maybe a little bit, but actually, and this is associated with Eleanor Ostrom, the economist, says what we really want to be doing is polycentric climate governance, which is approaching this, and the core of that is actually similar to the co-benefit story, which is that this is not all zero sum. This can be positive sum if it's framed in the right way, and you can get experimentation. If you don't want to get everybody moving in the same direction, actually let people try things out and reward those who move in the right direction. And frankly, that's what China has done very, very successfully. So that's kind of what the academic side says. So I think that at one level, on the adaptation side, you have to work at the subnational level. You have to work this principle of subsidiarity that came out of the European conversation. You have to work at the level that's closest to the ground where you understand what's going on. There is a slightly cynical angle to the whole subnational stuff. It always receives a resurgence when Mr. Trump gets elected, because really that's not possible to work at the global level. But I don't think that should distract us. I think objectively it's a good thing to do. But I do also feel that if you are trying to transform economies and societies, and particularly on the mitigation side, we are now in a world of industrial redevelopment and transformation. You need to have the national government involved in that, just because of the scale and the network effects. That's not going to happen at the subnational level by itself.
Thank you so much. As all of you know, these are challenging times to be ambitious, and thank you so much for giving us a pathway to imagine and dream and be ambitious together through what was a very interesting and dynamic presentation and conversation. Thank you so much to our speakers. Thanks to the Khemka Foundation for sponsoring this talk. To Perry World House for co-sponsoring it, and I invite all of you to join us at the back for a reception where we can continue the conversation together in smaller groups. Thank you so much.